All right, Shavuot, say good morning. Let us begin. So I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, Yoel and Sarah Kelman, in appreciation of all of the learning, Shiurim within the Kehillah, the week of learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsor in the merit of a Refuah Shalema of Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel, and our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Bobby and Lisa Lilienfeld, in memory of Bobby's grandmother, Florence Lilienfeld, Freda Sura Bas Yaakov Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael. The neshamas should have an aliyah, the families and nechama. And also with that, let us begin. So we are picking up, today's daf is Ayin Gimel 73, and we are picking up on Ayin Beis Amud Beis 72b Tan Rabban. I'm supposed to remember again, yesterday we were introduced to the really fascinating case of brothers who live in the same chutzner as their father. So if you remember again, the Mishnah discussed, the Mishnah explained, they all eat, they're supported at their father's table. So we saw the Gemara qualified that statement a little bit, but the Gemara ultimately explained that since they go ahead and live in separate places, therefore again, even though they're all eating at their father's table, they are considered to be like separate independent residents. And therefore, each of them must go ahead and contribute to the Eruv. To which the Gemara said, you see from here that what? That when establishing, how do you define a domicile? Domicile is defined ultimately by where you sleep. Because we'll say this would be the paradigmatic case, because here the brothers are eating in one place, they're eating at the father's home, they're sleeping in a different place in their own home, so which determines their residence? Now obviously the nafkamina, the practical difference is quite dramatic, because we'll say if their place of residence is defined by their father's home, then what? That effectively means that what? Everyone lives in the same house. If everyone lives in the same house, there's no need for Eruv. I mean, if there are other residents, there's a need for Eruv, but each brother doesn't have to independently participate in the Eruv. If, however, residence is defined by where you sleep, then each brother is indeed a separate and distinct domicile. So the Gemara goes on with this discussion about what defines a domicile. So Tan Rabbanan, here we go. Says the Gemara, Mish yesh la beis sharach sadra, if someone has a gatehouse, umir peses, or a portico, umir peses b'chatzer chavero, harei ze ein oser alav. So we'll say, so if a person goes ahead and has one of these structures, beis sharach sadra, which seems like a gatehouse, amir peses, a portico that seems to have some walls attached to it, so we'll say these do not qualify as a domicile. On the other hand, beis hateven, beis habakar, beis ha'itzim, beis ha'osros, if a person has a storehouse for straw, or a stable, I don't know if you call it a barn for cows, right? Beis habakar, beis ha'itzim, a storehouse for wood, beis ha'osros, or any other storehouse, and a person lives in one of these structures, hareza oser alav, these constitute a domicile. Rabbi Yehuda says, Eino oser ela makom dira bilvad. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Osai, that in order for a structure to go ahead and aser, and when we say aser means that it would prohibit carrying without an eruv. So Rabbi Yehuda says in order for a structure to qualify as a domicile, it has to be somewhere that is fit for someone to live and to actually have someone live there. Rabbi Yehuda, there was one story of Ben Nafcha. Ben Nafcha had 5 different courtyards in Usha. And what happens? The episode came before the Chacham. Va'amru eino oser ela beis dira bilvad. And they said Ben Nafcha, he only goes ahead and asers beis dira. What does that mean? Beis dira sagadaytcha ela ima makom dira. So it's very interesting. What the Gemara now is suggesting is that halacha l'maisa, the only time a residence causes an eruv issue is when halacha l'maisa someone lives there. But if you own property in a chutzner, but you do not live there, then enachinami, that does not cause a problem. I will say that's a major point, because again, this Ben Nafcha owned 5 properties. Obviously, he didn't live simultaneously in 5 properties. So the shaila is, he lives in one property for Shabbos. Does he have to participate in the other eruvs? To which the Chacham seemed to pass, and the answer to that was no. Now, both say the Gemara goes full circle. By the way, my makom dira. What defines your residence? Rav says, Makom Pita, where you eat. Where you eat is where you live. Top line, Ayin Gimel Amandal 73a. Shmuel Amar Makom Lina. Shmuel says where you sleep. So we'll say this is the fundamental machlokes. What defines where you live? Is it where you eat or is it where you sleep? So the Gemara says, Meisvei Haroim Vakayotzin Vaborginim V'Shomrei Peiros. So we'll say Rowan are shepherds. Kaitsonin are people. So we'll say they used to go ahead and dry figs. The way you would dry figs is you would spread them out in a field. So Kaitsonin are the people. Kaitzin are the people who would go ahead and watch. They were the watchmen, the fig watchmen. Borginin are the individuals who live in huts. So the Gemara says, Shomrei Peiros are the fruit watchmen, the orchard watchmen. So we'll say, Bisman Shedarkon Lolin Ba'ir Harein Ka'ancher. So we'll say, listen to this. So these individuals obviously would be out in the fields, right? All this was happening outside of the city, in the fields. So the shaila is, for Shabbos purposes, from where do we measure the tchum of these individuals? So bisman shedarkin lolin ba'ir. So when during the night these individuals normally come into the city and sleep in the city, harhein ka'anshe ha'ir. Then halacha l'maisa, they are treated like the residents of the city, and therefore they would get the tchum of the city. Bisman shedarkin lolin basodeh yesh lan alpayim l'chol ruach. But I will say when they sleep in the fields, right, in their place of work, when they sleep in the fields, then halacha l'maisa they get 2,000 amis from wherever their field domicile is. So we'll say, what do you see from there? It appears that is a proof to Shmuel that domicile is defined by where you sleep. By where you sleep. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam anan sahadi, timematulahu rifta hasam tfei nechaluhu. We'll say it's different. The only reason why sometimes these individuals go back into the city is because there's not food readily available for them in the fields. But Einachinami, if people were to bring them food in the fields, it is clear that they would much prefer that. Therefore, I will say, in reality, it makes sense to define their domicile, ultimately, again, by their places in the field, because that's really where they need to be. It's only because they have to come into the city for food that they do so. Amar Rav Yosef, Lo Shmiya Li Hashmaisa. So Rav Yosef says, I never heard this halacha. Now understand why this is a dramatic statement. Rashi says, Lo Shmiya Li Hashmaisa, Da'amarav Makom Pita Gorim. So we'll say, so what Rav Yosef was saying is, I never heard that Rav held that the place where you eat defines your domicile. Now we'll say, Rashi says, remember, Rav Yosef Chala V'Shachach Tamudo. The Gemara states also that Rav Yosef became ill, and as a result of his illness, he forgot all of his learning. V'haya Abaye Tamido Maskiro. And Abaye, his devoted disciple, would remind him. So also, it's very often you have these statements of Rav Yosef said, I never heard this before. And Abaye says, yes, Rebbe, you heard it, and actually you taught it to us. It's actually a very moving thing, right? About a Rebbe who lost his learning, and then the Talmud becomes. I will say, you see this. Is how often do we see this again in the world, where parents who raise children, then their role reversals as parents get older, and the children become the caretakers of the parent. That sometimes that is part of the cycle of life. That those who give you sometimes become the very ones who need from you. Sometimes the parents who give you life over time require you to help sustain them in life. Sometimes the very Rebbe who gave you your Torah leans on you ultimately again to give him back that Torah. It's a very, very moving relationship. Similarly, Abaye says to him, At Amrit Nihilan. So he says, At Amrit Nihilan, Vaha Amrit. He said, Rebbe, you actually taught us this. You taught us this, and you taught us this halacha in the following context. Now I will say, it's very interesting over here also, the way Abaye relates to Rav Yosef. Right? You would have thought that if Rav Yosef forgot his learning, then Abaye would be a little bit more gentle. But this always happens. Abaye says it very straight. Rebbe, you know this, and you taught it to us. You taught it to us. So also, so just also a fascinating idea sometimes in how to deal with people in crisis. Sometimes, there's an indirect approach, sometimes the direct approach. So what Abai was really doing was also rebuilding Rav Yosef's confidence. You have to imagine, again, for Rav Yosef, who was one of the Gedolei Hadar, to not know a statement of Rav is a very dramatic thing. So Rav Yosef, Rebbe, you know this. You know this. You taught it to us. Here's where you taught it to us. So listen to this. Va'aha ahamrit nihilan. Ha'achin sheyhochen al shulchan avi. So Rebbe, you taught it to us in the following context. Brothers who were eating on their father's table, v'yishenim bivasehem, but yet they slept in their own home. They slept in their own home. Tzrichin erev l'chol echad ve'echad. Every brother needs to participate in his own erev. V'amrina l'cha, and you said, Shma mina, makom lina gorem. Rabbi, when you taught this to us, we said to you, what do you see from here? That it is where you sleep, which defines your domicile. Va'amrit lan Allah, and Rabbi, you then commented to us, Am Rabbi Huda Marav, B'mekavle pras shaninu. That case, which is a statement of our Mishnah, is actually a case where the brothers aren't eating in their father's home, but rather, again, they are receiving support in their father's home. They're receiving support, so they get a stipend in their father's home. So they're actually eating and sleeping in their home, just being supported by their father. So it's not really a raya. So we'll say this is the machlokes Rav and Shmuel. What defines domicile? Rav says pita, where you eat. Shmuel says lina, where you sleep. Tan Rabbanan. Mishi yesh lo chamesh nashim mekablos prasmi ba'alehen. So we'll say if a man has 5 wives, and he is not 5 lives, 5 wives, right? You heard it right? 5 wives, and he's supporting all of them. Or the Gemara says v'chamisha avodim mekablin prasmi abeim. Or he has 5 servants, and he's supporting all of those servants. Now, the case over here is Reuven has 5 wives, but they're 5 different homes, 5 different residences. So they're all being supported by Reuven, but they live in 5 different locations. 5 servants, all being supported by Reuven, 5 different locations. It's using the webcam on the laptop. I'm not sure why. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Huda ben Beseira matir benashim osir ba'avadim. So Rabbi Huda ben Beseira ultimately again goes ahead and is matir benashim. So we'll say matir benashim means Rabbi Huda ben Beseira says that halacha lemaisa, so the women are considered to be like one with their husband. Which we'll say the logic is that a couple is a unit, and in this case 5 couples, right, or five wives, right? So a wife follows after her husband. Meaning, when I say follow after me, they're a unit. So even if the wife doesn't live with her husband, we reckon them as one entity. So therefore, each woman does not need an independent erev contribution, for she is counted together with her husband. So the Gemara says, "Va'oser ba'avodim." However, avodim, servants, ultimately again are not considered to be like one unit with their master, and therefore each servant who lives in a different home will require a separate independent contribution. Rabbi Huda ben Bava, Mati Bava, interesting, we'll say. Rabbi Huda ben Bava says just the opposite. He says servants are considered to be, like one unit, ultimately again with their master, but wives are considered to be independent entities, and therefore each servant is included in the erev contribution of his master, but each wife who lives in a different domicile must go ahead and contribute independently to the erev. Amarav, my time Rabbi Huda ben Bava. What's Rabbi Huda ben Bava's logic? That ultimately, again, a servant is considered to be at one with his master. So this is very interesting. Dichsiv v'Daniel bisra malka. Because the pasuk says that Daniel was in the service of the king. So we'll say this is really fascinating. So what Rashi is pointing out, bisra malka b'chol makom shu chashavei bisra malka. Daniel, wherever he was always considered to be in the service of the Persian king. It's not a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a reference to the Persian king. So the idea over here is you see that a servant, wherever he is always considered to be in the service of his master, which I will say is such an incredible idea, because by Daniel, it's by the king, it's by the Persian king, but Lamaisa, again, by us who are avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it also teaches you about what the nature of avdus is. An Eved is always engaged with his master. An Eved is always, that relationship is ever present. Every other relationship sometimes could be on, sometimes could be off, but an Eved, the Gemara says, always considered to be in the active service of his master. Such an incredible Musar. So Pshita bein Eitzel Avav Kid Amran. So we'll say again. So a father and a son relationship we already spoke about. Right? We already spoke about that. We'll say, so again, that's our Mishnah. That's our Mishnah. There's a little bit of a machlokes, exactly what happens with a father and son. But one thing is clear, which is there's definitely a connection, especially if this father is supporting the son. So if the father is supporting the son, there's a connection between the two, and then depending on the son's living arrangements and eating arrangements, will determine his eruv contribution. However, Isha Eitzel Baila, Ve'eved Eitzel Rabo, Pluked Rabbi Yehuda ben Beser, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So we'll say, so a woman's relationship with her husband if they live in two different homes, or an Eved's relationship with his master if they live in two different homes, that's a machlokes. Talmid Eitzel Rabo Mai. We'll say, what about a Talmud and a Rebbe? Interesting case. What happens if a Talmud and a Rebbe live in the same chutzner, right? So the teacher and the student live in the same chutzner. In this case, the student is being supported by the Rebbe. So we'll say, so remember, all of these cases presuppose support, because support, right, money is the bond which binds, or the bond that binds, right? So what happens if the Rebbe and student are living in the same chutzner, and halacha l'maisa, the Rebbe is supporting the Talmud? What happens there? So we'll say, when we're asking Gabe Erev, my Tashma, Dirav be Rabbi Chia Amar, Rav, who was a student of Rabbi Chia's yeshiva, said, Anu ein anu tzrichin la'arif, sharna sumchin al shulchanos Rabbi Chia. So Rav said, apparently Rav lived in the same chutzner as Rabbi Chia, and he said to the other Talmidim, we don't have to independently participate in the Eruv, for we are supported at the table of Rabbi Chia. We're supported at the table. Rabbi Chia be Rabbi Amar, Rabbi Chia, when he was a student in the yeshiva of Rabbi, he said, we don't have to participate in the Eruv, for we are supported at the table of Rebbe. So we'll say, so it appears to be from here that a Talmud who lives in the same chutzner as his Rebbe and is supported at the table of his Rebbe need not independently participate in the Eruv. We'll see all this halacha l'maisa. So boimine abayim rabba chamisha shegavo es Eruvin. So we'll see, we actually saw this case before. In this case, we'll see you have the following. Imagine we all go ahead, we're all the residents of the same chutzner. Our chutzner is chutzner A. We make an Eruv together. Now it happens to be, we would now like to make a joint Eruv with chutzner B. So you could carry in between the two chutzneros. So that's the case. Chamisha shegavos Eruvin kishamolich nes Eruvin l'makom acher Eruv echad l'kulan otzrichin Eruv l'chol echad ve'echad. So we'll say when chutzner A wants to make an Eruv with chutzner B, how is that done? Does that require a new collection from each of the residents of chutzner A, or could one person represent chutzner A, take an Eruv to chutzner B, and that's all? So the Gemara says, Amar lei Eruv echad l'kulan. So he responded, one Eruv is enough. You need not make another collection from all of the residents of chutzner A to bring that to chutzner B. Rather, one person could act on behalf of chutzner A, bring food to chutzner B, and shalom al Yisrael. But I will say, but isn't the case of brothers who live together in a chutzner? Brothers live together in a chutzner. Isn't that similar to a case of an Eruv that's already been collected from a group? And yet, again, the Mishnah indicates that halacha l'maisa, they have to each go ahead and participate in their own Eruv. What's the case? We'll say the case in the Mishnah where we require the brothers, remember again, back to the Mishnah's case, where brothers are living in their own homes, but are supported by their father. When is it that we require each of the brothers to participate in the Eruv? When there are other people living in the chutzner. Demigo dahani asri, hani nami asri. Because I will say, once the presence of other residents goes ahead and prohibits on the brothers now have to make an Eruv, so the brothers will now prohibit on each other as well. Hachinai mistabra, this would appear to be clear. Diktani imosai, when is this so? Bizman shemolichin es Eruvin b'makom acher. But when is it that the brothers have to participate in the Eruv? When the Eruv itself is being kept at the home of one of the other residents. Avalim haya Eruvin ba etzlam. But if the Eruv is being kept in one of the brothers' homes or the father's home, or there's no one else living in the chutzner except the fathers and the brothers, then no Eruv would be necessary at all. Shma mina. Indeed, see that this is correct. Good. So I just want to point out the fundamental machlokes between Rav and Shmuel as to ultimately, again, what defines domicile. Is it where you eat or is it where you sleep? That machlokes is still unresolved. We're going to see the halacha. We'll just wait till we get to the Mishnah. Then we'll close out the halacha l'maisa on this sugya. But what we clearly see is that anytime there is an element of support binds people together. And even if they are living in separate residences, if father is supporting sons, husbands supporting wives, masters supporting servants, rebbes supporting talmid, that creates a bond between these individuals, which, depending on the circumstances, may obviate the need for independent Eruv collections. So, I'll say first, enter the first wide line, Ayin Gimel Alaf. Again, we'll see the halacha l'maisa in just a bit. So, Minei Rav Chia bar Adam Rav Sheshes. Bnei Rav da'achli nama babaga, va'asu ubaisi bebei Rav. So let's listen to this. What about the yeshiva students who go ahead and have their meals bebaga? Rashi says baga was beis ushpiz babeka. This was an inn in the valley. So they would go ahead and they would have their meals, we'll say essentially at an off-site location, at an inn in the valley, but they would come back to sleep in yeshiva. So we'll say, here we go again. So the students of the yeshiva would have their meals. There was no dining room in the yeshiva. We'll say, the first time that there was really a dining room in the yeshiva was Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, was Rav Meir Shapira. Rav Meir Shapira, so really what Bachrim used to do before, and they would have what they call teg. They would go ahead and they would have families. They'd be set up with families in their respective towns, and they would go out for meals. The Lubliner Rav, Rav Meir Shapira, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Livracha, understood that if you make the Bachrim go out, first of all, again, often they were set up with families who were destitute and had very little for themselves. So obviously the Bachrim didn't want to eat if they knew they were taken from a family. And also the distractions that it has to learning. So Meir Shapira, in his yeshiva, Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin, which obviously you have to understand was like the Waldorf of his time, that he made a dining room. Not only did he make a dining room, but the Bachrim ate on china. They ate on china, and they had fresh linens. Under things that were. Everybody complains about yeshiva food, right? No matter where you go. So remember, at least there is yeshiva food. That was unheard of. So just pointing out, that was the practice for many, many, many generations. There was no dining room in a yeshiva. Talmidim ate in local people's homes. So here the Talmidim, so the Bnei Yeshiva, they're eating their meals at an inn in the valley, but they're coming to go ahead and sleep in yeshiva. So the Gemara says, Ki mashchinu l'tchuma mi beirav mashchinu l'hu o mi baga mashchinu. So when we measure their tchum, from where do we measure their tchum? Should we measure their tchum ultimately again from the inn in which they eat, or should we measure it from the yeshiva in which they sleep? Amrlei mashchinu mi beirav. We measure their tchum from the yeshiva. I v'hari nosines eruva b'soch ha'payim amal v'asi ubayis bebeisei. So we'll say, but here's the problem with that. We'll say, let's take the paradigmatic example of Erev Tchumen. What does Erev Tchumen do? We'll say, what does it do? You take food, and what do? You deposit it somewhere within your current 2,000 amas. And we'll say, what do we do then? We measure your new tchum from where? From your food. Why do we measure your new tchum from your food? Because what do we assume? That where your food is where your home is. Right, that your food establishes your domicile. So I don't understand. We'll say that's the paradigmatic example. That's how Erev Tchumen works. You put food somewhere, that becomes your new residence. We now measure a new tchum from that new residence. So isn't that clear? Isn't that abundantly clear that home is where your food is? Yet you're telling me here by the yeshiva students that they're going to measure the tchum from where they're sleeping. To which the Gemara, I'll tell you why. Bahu anansadi ubahada anansadi. So we'll say the Gemara says we could explain the different circumstances of both of these cases. Watch this. Bahu anan sahadi, di mistar hasam nechale. So we'll say again, when a person goes ahead and puts their Eruv food somewhere in Erev Shabbos, a person actually would be okay sleeping out there by the food that night. Why? Because we'll say, obviously, if a person is placing an Eruv for Eruv Tchumen, they have to travel somewhere on Shabbos. That's what it means. I have to go to some new location. So because I have to go to some new location, look, if I had to sleep out, out there with my food, and that would be okay, because that would be a head start on my journey. Therefore, again, I will say, home is where you place your food. Ubahada, but in the case of the yeshiva students, Ba'ada anan sahadi, di maisu lehu rifta lebeirav nechalutfei. Both say the yeshiva students don't want to go to the inn in the valley. What would they much prefer? They'd much prefer a dining room, right? They'd much prefer to have their food at the yeshiva because the yeshiva is their primary home. It's just because at the end of the day, they can't go ahead and get their food in the yeshiva that they have to go out. But it's clear that their primary residence in their eyes, ultimately again, is the yeshiva. Good. We're supposed to, it's actually an interesting case. So if a father and a son, or for that matter, a Talmud and a Rebbe, live in the same chutzner. So we'll say, actually, we're asking with two chutzner. I'll see in just a moment. Are they reckoned as two individuals or as a single entity? So we'll say, Rashi actually points out that this is going to have ramifications for a case of one chutzner inside of another chutzner, or rather than staying inside of it means one chutzner behind another chutzner. Suppose if you can imagine you have chutzner A really opens up to the Rosh Hashanah. Behind chutzner A is chutzner B. But of course, the only way to get to the Rosh Hashanah from chutzner B is how? To walk through chutzner A. So if you look at Rashi says over here, Av ubno, harav v'tamido kirabim damu, linyin shtei chatzeros zulif nimizu, udrisas regel apnimis ala chitzona, utram b'masnisin em hayu shal yechidim shiachet dar b'pnimis, davi regel hamutaris b'kuan. So we'll say, we're going to leave this case for a little bit. What the Gemara is asking over here is in cases where you need a rabbim. It has to be something that is considered to be public in order to go ahead and create Eruv issues. So do a father and his son create a public scenario? Does a Rav and his Talmud create a public scenario? Okay, yechidim damu. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, are they considered to be like rabbim? Okay, yechidim damu. Tzrichen Eruv? Oh, ain't tzrichen Eruv. So I'll say similarly again. Ultimately, if a father, if a father and a son or Rebbe and a Talmud live in a chutzner together, just the two of them, do they require an Eruv or not? The Gemara says, "Mavui shalahen niter b'lechi v'kora in niter b'lechi v'kera." So let's say if a father and a son live in a mavui together, is their mavui permitted with a lechi or a kara, vertical beam or a horizontal beam, or not? So let's say Rashi says over here, niter b'lechi v'kora, the kamalan ein mavui niter b'lechi v'kora ad shiubatim b'chatzer suchim. We'll say a mavui can only be permitted with a lechi and a kora only if multiple homes and multiple chatzeros open up into it. So the shaila is, if the father, let's say, lives on a chatzar on one side, a son lives on a chatzar on the other side, is that called multiple chatzeros? Or because their father and son is only called one chatzar? So Amarle, Tinisua, Ha'avu beno, Av ubeno harav v'tamido, Bisman she'ein iman diurin harin ki yechidim ve'in tzichas. So we'll say, first of all, father and a son, a Rav and a Talmud, when no one else lives with them, there is no Eruv that is necessary. They are considered to be like one entity. The Gemara says, Umavui shalahan nitar belechi v'kora. But halacha l'maisa, interestingly enough, their mavui rebosai is considered, however, when they live in two separate chatzeros that open up into the mavui, that is considered to be like two different chatzeros, and therefore halacha l'maisa can be permitted with lechi and a korah. So on one hand, the Gemara says that if a father and son live together in a chatzar, halacha l'maisa, again, they do not prohibit each other. They're looked at as one entity, and therefore no eruv is necessary. Yet their chatzeros would be separate and distinct, so as to allow the mavoi to be permitted with a lechi and a korah. So we'll say, let's just close out this sugya now for just a minute. So remember, again, halacha l'maisa, how do we paskin in terms of what defines domicile? Is it where you eat, or ultimately, again, is it where you sleep? So we'll see here the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Shulchan Aruch Paskins in Shin Ayin Sif Hey. So in Shin Ayin Sif Hey, Shin Ayin Sif Hey, Shulchan Aruch writes as follows: Misha ochel b'makom echad, v'yosher makom acher. If someone goes out and eats in one place but sleeps in another place, makom achilaso hu ha'ikar. I will say home is where you eat. Home is where you eat. V'sham hu oser. Hilchach ha'achin she'ochlin b'beis avian v'yishinim b'vasehem einon osrin. So therefore, I will say brothers who live in their own homes in the Chatzar, but again, in the case of the Mishnah, but are supported by their father and eat in their father's home, do not need to make an independent Eruv contribution. Pras v'ochlin b'vateyan osin. Rabbi is very interesting. But if the father supports them, gives them an allowance, but they each eat in their own homes, they are treated like separate entities. V'hani mili kishenosis was that case. And the Shulchan goes on. So we'll say halacha l'maisa. The Gemara paskins like Rav that where you eat ultimately again defines your domicile. So interestingly enough, it appears that the support piece itself is not really the ikar. That even if halacha l'maisa again a person is supported by a father or by a parent or by a rebbe for that matter, halacha l'maisa, everything depends on where it is that you have your meals. If you have your meals, that's what your home is, and that's ultimately, again, that'll determine for tchum purposes, but that'll also determine for Eruv contribution purposes. I'll just read you this other halacha. This is in Siman Tov Tes, halacha Hey, because it's also quite interesting. Shulchan Aruch Paskins again about a father and a son. Actually, you know what? We'll leave this. We'll leave the father and son piece for just a little bit later, actually, when we get to the next Mishnah. So we'll say, but that is halacha l'maisa. At least on a basic level, we paskin like Rav. Domicile is defined by where you eat. Good. Chamesh chatzeros. We'll say Mishnah Baram Avayin Gimel. Chamesh chatzeros psuchos zulazu upsuchos lamavos. So we'll say again. Here you have a picture of this in Rashi. Simple case. You have 5 chatzeros, each chatzer side by side. The chatzeros each open up into each other, but also open up into a mavui, open up into a shared alleyway. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Eruvu bechatzeros v'nishtatvu b'mavui, mutarn bechatzeros v'asur mavui. So we'll say, remember again, if there was an Eruv chatzeros that was made, but halacha l'maisa, we'll say, remember, Eruv chatzeros in this context can mean 2 things. Each chatzer made an Eruv, but all of the chatzeros also joined in an Eruv as well. So therefore, again, you could carry from any chatzer to the next. Say if they made an Eruv chatzeros, but they did not make a shituf muvaos. So they made an Eruv, but didn't make a shituf. What's the halacha? Mutar b'chatzeros asar mavoi. They are permitted to carry in the chatzeros, but it is usher to carry in the mavoi. Now, both said this goes back to yesterday's daf. Rashi says, why is this? Asar mavoi. Al Eruv b'makom shituf. Remember again, we learned this halacha l'maisa yesterday, that again, an Eruv does not obviate the need for a shituf. See, even there is an Eruv chatzeros, you still require shitufe or shituf muvaos, shituf mavoi, shitufe muvaos. Good. Amud Beis. V'im nishtatfu b'mavui. But we'll say what happens if they made a shituf? So again, they joined in a partnership for the mavui, but not if so. I'm sorry. But what happens if they also joined in a shituf muvos? Then mutarin kan v'kan. So we'll say again, if they made an erev chatzeros and they made a shituf muvos, then shalom al Yisrael. Everybody's happy because this way they could carry in the chatzeros and they could also carry in the mavui. Erevu bechatzeros. V'ishtatfu mavui. Supposed to listen to this. Let's say so they did what they were supposed to do. They did an erev chatzeros. They did a shituf muvos. The shachach echad mibnei chatzer v'lo irev. Let's say one of the members of the chatzer forgot to participate in the eruv. So what do we do? Mutarin kan v'kan. Ultimately, again, he's mutar. Mutar. So we'll see exactly what this means. See exactly what this means. So the Gemara will say what this sounds like over here is if they forgot to participate in the eruv chatzeros, but the shituf is still intact. So it sounds like over here what it's saying is that the shituf can be relied on to be matir not just the mavui, but the chatzeros as well, which of course contradicts what we just said before. Because at the beginning of the Mishnah, we just said that shituf muvaos is not enough to take care of erev chatzeros in a separate erev chatzeros. So we'll resolve it in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, So we'll say, what happens if one of the members of the mavui forgot to participate in the sheet of muvaos? What's the halacha? Mutarin bechatzeros va'asurin b'mavui. So you are mutar, so you are permitted to carry in the chatzeros, but it is usher to carry in the mavui. Shahamavui the chatzeros ki chatzar lebatim. Because we will say the mavui is to the chatzeros, what the homes are, what the chatzar is to the homes. Okay, so there's a lot to analyze over here, and the problem is a lot of what appear to be contradictory statements. Here we go. Money. So we'll say, whose opinion does the Mishnah reflect? So money. Rabbi Meir Hida Amar, Ba'inon Erev Uba'inon Shituf. So we'll say our Gemara seems to reflect the view of Rabbi Meir, who holds that halacha l'maisa, you require an Erev and you require a Shituf. You require both of these items. So we'll say this goes back to yesterday's daf, that an Erev by itself is not going to work, a Shituf by itself is not going to work, but even if you have a Shituf Muvos, you still require an Erev Chatzeros. What's this? The Gemara says, Ema Mitziyasi, yet look at the middle of the Mishnah, middle case. Im Nishtatfu b'mavui mutar kan v'kan. If they made a Shituf Muvos, that is enough to permit everybody in a mavui, and in the chatzeros, asa'an l'rabbanan the amari b'chadasagi. We'll say now that makes it sound like shituf muvos is enough, even without erev chatzeros. To which the Gemara says, "Lo kasha." It's not a contradiction. I'm sorry. Asa'an l'rabbanan the amari b'chadasagi halo kasha v'im nishtatfu nami kamar. We'll say what it means is not only if you made a shituf, but also if you made a shituf. If you also made a shituf, in addition to the Erev Chatzeros, then it is mutter in both places. I aim a safe. Look at the end of the Mishnah. So we'll say, all we're just trying to figure out over here is whose opinion is reflected in the Mishnah. Remember again, going back to yesterday, where the Machlokes Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon held that you don't need both a Shituf and Erev Chatzeros. One could take care of everything. Rabbi Meir says, no, you need both. Even if you have a Shituf Muvos, you still require an Erev Chatzeros. Remember again, we'll say, what was Rabbi Meir's logic? What was his logic? His logic is, Shema Yishkechu Hatinokos. Because if all we do is rely on a Shituf, but we don't have an Erev Chatzeros, the children in the Chatzar will never see any type of collection, and the concept of Eruv will be forgotten. So that was, we're just trying to figure out who to attribute the Mishnah to. So next, Amos Seba, look at the end of the Mishnah. If you made an Erev Chatzeros and a Shituf in the Mavui, and one of the members of the Chatzar forgot to participate in the Erev Chatzeros. So what's the halacha? Mutarim kan v'kan. Ultimately, again, they're permitted in the Chatzar, permitted in the Mavui. So what's the case? Hechidami. Idolo batil. So we'll say if the guy who forgot to participate in the Erev Chatzeros was not mevatel his rishos, amai mutarim, then why is everyone else mutar? We'll say again, non-participation in the Eruv really prohibits everyone from carrying inside of the Chatzar. So if a guy forgot to participate in the Eruv Chatzeros and he was not mevatel his rishos, why is everyone else permitted? Elapshita de batel. Otherwise, they must be talking about the case that the guy who went ahead and didn't participate in the Eruv was mevatel his rishus. That's why everyone else is permitted. So the Gemara says, Amos Sevia, look at the end of the Mishnah. If one of the members of the Mavui forgot to participate in the Shituf, mutarin bechatzeros v'asurin b'mavui. So we'll say ultimately again, everyone is permitted to carry in their respective chatzeros because they have an Erev Chatzeros. But because someone forgot to participate in the Shituf, no one is permitted to carry in the mavui. But I don't understand why. V'ida batil amai asrun b'mavui. We'll say if you're setting this up as a case where the person who forgot to participate in the shituf is mevatel his rishos, if he's mevatel his rishos, then that should allow everyone else to carry in the mavui. The chitema kasav meir ain't bit rishos mavui. Supposed to maybe you'll say interesting. So we'll say what's fascinating is the Gemara is presupposing that the concept of bittul rishos applies in a mavui. So we'll say, which is something we've just never encountered. We just never discussed it before. Up until now, whenever we spoke about Bittul Rishos always is, where is it taking place? So we'll say, where is it taking place? In a Chatzar, right? So I forgot to participate in the Erev Chatzeros of my Chatzar. What do? I yield my rights. I will say again, remember, actually, it's Machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, exactly what you do. Am I conveying my rights? That's Beis Shammai, or I'm just being misalik. I'm just removing myself from the chutzner. I have no rights in the chutzner. We never saw that in a mavui. The Gemara just suggested that maybe there's a concept of bittul in a mavui, right? Which means I will say that. Well, now remember, what does bittul in a mavui mean? I will say bittul in a mavui means a chutzner. A chutzner says we don't have rights in this mavoi. That's a collective yielding, right? We don't have rights in this chatzar. So I say, well, maybe Rabbi Meir holds in bittul rishus mavoi. But I say maybe Rabbi Meir holds bittul rishus is only a din in a chatzar. There is no bittul rishus in a mavoi. Is that so? The Gemara says, Vatanya, we learned shari bittul lachem rishuso. Yet Rabbi say ultimately again, we learned in the Brayos elsewhere that again the lashon that was used was you can go ahead. I'm sorry, V'hatanya, we learned Hashari Bita Lachem Rashuso. That Rabbi say in the case, the Gemara was quoting over here that we saw in Samech Chesam days. The verbiage that was used is you could carry in the mavui. Why? Because he was mavatal his rishus, which seems to indicate to us that Bita Rishus can occur in a mavui as well. David Rabbi Meir Elapshita Delo Batal. Rather, Rabbi says you have to set up the case in the Mishnah as where the individual who forgot to participate in the Eruv did not yield his rishos. 1 second. So we'll say, so that would be the safer case. So we'll say, I'm sorry, let me clarify. So in the case in the Mishnah that said that if one of the members of the Mavui forgot to participate in the Shituf, so what's the halacha? No one could carry in the Mavui, but everyone could still carry in their respective chatzeros. And what's the case of both? The case is where the individual or the chatzer who forgot to participate in the shituf was not mevatel their rishos. Now, if the seifa is the case, I mean the seifa to labatel, reishan ami labatel. So we'll say if the end case of the Mishnah is the case where the people who forgot to participate were not mevatel their rishos, therefore the earlier case should also be a situation of where the individual in the chatzar was not mevatel his rishus, yet halacha l'maaseh said that the members of the chatzar could still carry. To which the Gemara says, Reish nami d'lo batel, Reish of the Sefer Rabbi Meir, mitzias Rabbanon. Is it possible to say that the Reish and the Sefer of the Mishnah, the Rabban, are Rabbi Meir, and the middle case is Rabbanon? So we don't like that, because generally, again, we don't like to split up attribution of a Mishnah. Rather, the Gemara says, Kul Rabbi Meir he. On the entire case, the entire Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. The time of my, so we'll say, what's the logic in the case? Rabbi Meir ba'ina eruv. I'm sorry, but time of my Rabbi Meir ba'ina eruv or ba'ina shitov. But say in general, this is what we just said yesterday's daf. Why does Rabbi Meir hold that you require both an eruv and both a shitov? Why is that? So the Gemara says, in order shal lishkoach Torah's eruv minatinokos. So we established this before. This is very important. Rabbi, if you were to back Rabbi Meir into a court, Rabbi Meir, really, if you make a shitov muvaos, is an eruv chatzeros still necessary? Which I will say, the logic of this is very profound. If you've already joined all of the chatzers, right, all of the chatzeros, into a joint entity for purposes of carrying of a mavui, shouldn't that automatically cover your eruv chatzeros? So if you ask Rabbi Meir, come on, tell me the truth. Does the shitov muvaos cover your eruv chatzeros? Rabbi Meir would say, yes, like the Rabbanon. But again, like we said before, but what is Rabbi Meir's concern? Rabbi Meir's concern was shalolishkach Torah's eruv minatinokos. His concern about say is that shituf muvos is something that almost no one sees. The children don't see it. So the concern is that the children, next generation, will forget. If all we do is shituf muvos, people will forget about the concept of eruv. Therefore, Rabbi Meir holds that halacha l'maisa, you have to do a localized eruv in the chatzar in order to go ahead and show, in order that the children should not forget about the concept of eruv. So we'll say, now watch this. V'halcha kevan deruba eruvu lo mishtacha. So we'll say, this is incredible. Rabbi Meir will say like this. So we'll say, Rabbi Meir will say that halacha l'maisa, in a case where there was, listen to this, there was a sheet of muvos. Everyone in the chutzner joined in the eruv except for one guy. We are not going to prohibit the members of the eruv from going ahead, for the members of the chutzner, from going ahead and carrying in their chutzner because of this one guy. Why? Because the majority of people, in fact, went ahead and participated in the eruv. In other words, we'll say, the Meir's whole logic as to why you can't rely on an eruv chatzir, on a sheet of muvos, is because the children won't see. But really he holds that when there is a shituf, that covers the chutzner. Therefore, the Gemara is suggesting in the case where they made a shituf, they made an eruv, but one guy didn't participate in the eruv, we're not going to prohibit everyone else from carrying in the chutzner because of this one guy, because technically the chutzner is covered by the shituf, and the children do see the eruv because everyone participated in the eruv. Amar Rav Yehuda, Rav lo tani psucho zulazu. So we'll say just quickly, in Rav's version, he didn't have the chatzeros opening up to one another. V'chein Rav Kahana, Rav lo tani psucho zulazu. So we'll say ultimately again in Rav's version, the chatzeros were not opening up. They were all opening up to the mavui, but they were not opening up to each other. Rav Kahana gufei lo tani psucho zulazu. Rav Kahana himself did not go ahead and understand this as a case of opening up to one another. I'm going to abide Rav Yosef. My time of the lokasani psucho zulazu. Why don't you have this as a case of the chatzeros opening up one to the other? Kasavar kol shitov she'ein machnisa umotzi derech psachim b'mavui lav shmei shitov. Because we'll say something very interesting. With this, we'll pick this up tomorrow, Mirat Hashem. That in order for a shitov to work, Rabbi Say, the shitov has to come out. It has to emerge from the chatzeros into the mavui. But if the shitov is not brought out from the chatzeros into the mavui, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, the shituf won't work. Therefore, we'll say the concern is if you set this up as a case where the chatzeros open up into each other, it's possible to merge the chatzeros with the mavui without ever bringing the shituf out from the chatzer into the mavui. Therefore, they choose to set it up as a case where the chatzeros don't open up into each other, which requires ultimately again the shituf to be brought out from the chatzer into the mavui. This notion that for the shituf to work, it must be brought out into the chatzar, Mirat Hashem will continue with tomorrow. But I will say, I just want to point out this dramatic idea by Rabbi Meir, which again, we'll have to see if it's halacha l'mais or not, but even Rabbi Meir, who holds that you can't rely on a shituf instead of an eruv, that even when there's a shituf, requires an eruv. Apparently, again, the Gemara says that he will agree that in a case where one person forgot to participate in an eruv, that one person's non-participation will not prohibit everyone else. Since in that case there was an eruv made in the chatzar, the children do see it, one person didn't participate, in that case you could rely on the shituf to be maftir the chatzar. All right, we'll pick up over here tomorrow, Hashem.